What's up, guys? Welcome to Breakshift's Hidden Relics tier list. Unlike the card tier list, there's actually a small enough number of things here that we're going to be putting them onto a real, actual tier list here. The tiers are going to be pretty simple. They're basically just a rough estimation of how much your chance to win is going to increase if you get this relic. Except for the bleed tier I have here at the bottom. That's specifically going to be for relics who are extremely powerful if you get them with the bleed starter, and mediocre if you get them on the blade starter. There's enough of those that I felt like I should just make a separate tier for them because they don't conveniently fit into the other tiers. And we are going to be taking into account the relic's rarity when we rank these, because it's not really fair to compare common relics to rares. But let's go ahead and get into it. So first up, we have the Thorny Bramble. The Thorny Bramble says, the first time each turn you apply bleed to an enemy, also apply vulnerable 1. And this one goes into bleed tier immediately. This is pretty much permanent vulnerable on any one enemy at minimum, and oftentimes every enemy in a combat. If you want to, you can just, put one silent shiv on them and they're vulnerable. Having the enemy be vulnerable while they're bleeding is really good, because you're generally going to be getting a large chunk of damage out of your bleed, and now it's getting multiplied. If you're playing with the one for all modifier on, then this will be permanent vulnerable on you as well, which is pretty dangerous. But you should be aiming to full block, and bleed decks tend to be a little more defensive generally, so you can definitely work around that. It's not too harsh of a downside. If you're on the blade starter, this is not useless. It's pretty mediocre, but it wouldn't be the craziest thing in the world to toss in 1 or 2 decent bleed cards that you might have lying around just to take advantage of that vulnerable. Having access to vulnerable is pretty important. Next, we have the Overripe Guava. This one says, at the start of each battle, combo 1 and rage 25%, and that goes into A tier. I guess I should mention the rarity as well as I go through these. This is a common relic, and the Thorny Bramble is an uncommon relic. But yeah, the Guava is perhaps an unassuming effect. 25% rage doesn't seem like that much. Combo 1. It's the smallest amount of combo you can be gaining, but this really, really helps in any sort of aggressive build, which is basically all blade builds, and some of the bleed builds too, of course. It's just gonna get you off to the races that much faster. Hitting max combo on turn 1's easier if you draw into literally any combo gain you're there. If you have a heavy hitting swift card, which you're gonna be looking for, you should probably have one in your deck. You draw that turn 1, it's going to go absolutely crazy with the Guava. Very, very easy to kill relatively low health enemies with this thing if you're just picking off one guy in a multi-enemy fight, or just early in the run. This is going to absolutely crush the early fights. Super strong relic. Next up, we've got the Butter Knife, common relic. Each time you expel a card, add 1 hidden blade to hand. This one goes into B tier. It is a little bit tough to take huge advantage of this, because you're not going to have all that many expel cards usually. You might have a couple powers, but, powers on hidden, there's quite a few expensive ones. Your smoke bombs, your sleight of hands, your responses, etc. There's a lot of expensive buffs that you might be trying to stack up, and so you're not going to really have any energy after you've played that to be gaining combo or, drawing cards or anything. So the hidden blades are probably not going to contribute all that much damage. It's something, it's discard fodder sometimes, but nothing that's really going to, shape the build you're doing or anything. It's just okay. Next we have our first rare relic, the Stinging Nettle. This one's also going to be B tier. This one says, the first instance of damage from an attack applies bleed equal to that amount. So In theory, this could be quite a bit of extra damage adding on, but it's not all that easy to do like one big instance of damage. Note the wording on that, it is an instance. So it's not like the first attack card you play. So if you play a Swift card and it triggers a bunch of times, only the first trigger is going to count towards the Stinging Nettle. Nevertheless, you can definitely put this thing to work and get a lot of bleed out of it. There's some generic heavy-hitting cards that you might have, stuff like an aggressive attack, and other just expensive attacks that you can toss in with a little bit of rage, and suddenly you dump a huge amount of bleed on turn 1. It's going to provide some amount of bleed every turn, if nothing else. It's great for bleed uptime, if that's something you care about, but not super useful on decks that don't really care about bleed all that much. It's just a middling amount of damage. You can definitely make it work, but on average, you won't be like super thrilled to find this one. Next we have another rare, the Chess Clock. This one says, the first time each turn you would gain combo over your max, trigger the bleed of the enemy with the most bleed. Somewhat complicated. This one is another bleed tier relic. Obviously, if I've stacked up a whole bunch of bleed, being able to trigger the bleed every single turn on like a boss enemy or an elite is ridiculous. It's an insane amount of damage, and you're going to be very happy that you have this thing. And if you don't have a lot of bleed, this thing is just a total waste, and it's going to deal way less damage than even something like the Stinging Nettle. So, as for that condition, gaining combo over your max, it's not that hard, especially if you've got the rebounding combo gain cards in hand, right? So either your quickness or your lick the knife. That's a card that you can just play and hold every turn if you want, to guarantee that you're triggering the Chess Clock. There's, various spells or spell-related relics that you could be using to time this. Plenty of easy ways to take advantage of it. It really is just a matter of how much bleed are you applying to turn into damage in the first place. So if you have a lot of bleed, this is like a really high tier relic, and if you don't, then it's really low tier, and that's what the bleed tier is for. Next we have the Assassin's Arsenal. Every 5th time you generate a Hidden Blade or Silent Shiv, you rage 50%. This is an elite relic. And this one I'm going to put in A tier. It's actually quite a bit of rage that you're getting, and naturally you mostly want to be pairing this with the Hidden Blade generators because they're going to benefit from the rage. But the fact that you can get it off the Shiv generators is not bad at all, especially if you have some of the other counting relics. The Shivs will increment the counters on that, your cutting fans, your blade belts and stuff, to give you the hidden blades anyway. It's very easy in general to just create a bunch of hidden blades all at once at the start of the turn using, like your trigger phrases, your phantom walks, that kind of thing. You can dump a lot of resource into just creating hidden blades, and you'll build up all that rage before you actually have to play any of them. So pretty easy to maximize the value of this thing. You can manipulate the number ahead of time to have really big push turns. Just a really good elite relic. Very often this will be a good choice if you're focused on attack damage at all, which most decks at least have some amount of. Next we have the Fistful of Salt. At the start of each turn, each enemy suffers Clot 1, apply weak 1. So this will be a B tier relic. This is one of those that cares about bleed uptime. If you can make all the enemies bleed just a little bit, then they're going to be permanently weakened as long as they're bleeding, which is really good. The fact that the enemies, you get like one turn to jumpstart it basically, right? Because on the first turn, they haven't taken any actions yet. You put the bleed on them. They're immediately weak. You can combine this with any number of other things, lacerations, purging bleeded out, various other relics that apply bleed early on, which we'll get to in a bit. Not that hard to just have perma weak up. Also, weakness naturally goes well with bleed. Bleed decks don't mind playing more defensively. because the bleed damage over time will deal the damage that you need to. You don't need to be super proactive in that regard as long as you're just stacking up the bleed. So it's pretty decent. Next we have the Fencing Mask. Fencing Mask is another elite, and it says, for each combo gained past your max block 6, this one is going to be our first C tier. This is not a particularly good artifact. Basically, it turns cards that gain combo into cards that gain block under specific situations, which is not an effect that you like super care about. So a lot of the best combo gaining cards are already block related, right? Like you've got your bides, you've got your quicknesses. These are cards that are, the quickness is obviously in the starter deck for Blade, and it's a common aside. Bide is a common. Often these are going to be like your bread and butter combo gain cards. And so, like, they're already gaining a decent chunk of block. Adding on, like, some potential extra block, maybe it's helpful, but a lot of times it's going to be you don't super care about the block and you're just playing it for combo, or it's already enough block and this is just going to waste, or you don't even have enough combo to be gaining combo past max and you can't use this thing at all. Your deck would have to have just like a really insane amount of combo generation for this to be like a super reliable defensive option. If you wanted to do one of those builds where you just get up to max combo and sit on it and spam out balanced cards, then like in theory you could use this to turn your cards into very reliable block generators. But now your deck building's being called into question, because why would you be playing all of those cards in a deck that only wants to go up to max combo as quickly as possible and then sit on it? So not a huge fan of this one. Next we have Caltrops, and I am a huge fan of this one. It's going to be A tier. This is an elite relic. It says at the end of each turn, spend 1 combo to delay draw 1. That's a really strong effect. Combo is not worth 1 full card, right? Trading 1 full card for 1 combo is not a good deal, so doing the reverse is a very good deal. Giving up just 1 combo to gain a whole card, that's pretty potent. If you just have like a reasonable amount of combo gain in your deck, you'll be able to get right back up to full. If you have like denser combo gain cards, then you can use this on turns where like you have your first turn, maybe you don't have any combo at all. You just lose the combo that you started with from your starting relic to get the extra draw, and then immediately next turn you're going to be able to regain that, and you'll find your dense combo cards eventually, faster than usual even because you're drawing extra. Having more cards in hand in general is just really, really potent. This is a pretty good way to get that. Very, very big fan of this one. Next we have the Blackjack. This is an elite relic. The first time each turn you hit 50% rage, combo 1. The Blackjack is going to be another C tier. It's shockingly difficult to make use of. 50% rage is non-trivial. You do definitely have to put some work into this. You can't just play some random card with a redstone and get this to pop off. You actually have to be like double playing a redstone quickness, or like double playing a surefoot, activating some sort of more expensive card, so using something like a dawn raid or something, right? Like it's a somewhat significant investment to get this thing to trigger. And even in the example of like the redstone quickness, which is a pretty common strategy in hidden decks, you're already gaining 2 combo off the quickness if you're double playing it. You've got the 1 free combo you start with. Like, there's a pretty decent chance that if you double play that quickness, you didn't even need the extra combo from this thing. It's not all that great. If you had like some dramatically increased combo cap or something, I guess this would be pretty good, but that's not going to happen very often. Definitely a C tier. Next up, we've got the Falmer's Falks, I think is how you pronounce that. This is a rare, and it's also going to be A tier. It's quite good. Each time you play a 0-cost card, delay rage 25%. So this is very similar to the Assassin's Arsenal in terms of its functionality. It's in the same tier because this is rare. So like the fact that it's just better than the Assassin's Arsenal is okay, because it is a higher rarity relic. The fact that you're getting delay rage instead of immediate rage is actually generally a pretty good thing, because it means that on the next turn you have all that rage right from the get-go, and every single card you play is going to get full benefits from it. So just 2 turns back-to-back where you generate a good chunk of Hidden Blades means that the Falmer's Fox is going to be dealing ridiculous amounts of damage. It's so much rage you can get with just a handful of Hidden Blade generators. You don't have to try all that hard with this thing. And obviously it works with plenty of stuff besides just Hidden Blade generators, right? If you have, I mean, I guess you could use it even with like a building steam. It works with stuff like the Dueling Buckler. It works with stuff that reduces the cost of cards, like the Eldritch Blessing even. Just a really, really easy to use, really strong effect, and that is definitely an A tier relic. Next, we're going to have Spice start every even turn at max combo. This is our first S tier. This is a ridiculous effect. It's so good. Maximum combo. It doesn't even matter if you've increased the cap or not. You always go straight up to full. So after your starting relic has increased the combo cap, this thing just grooves right along with that. The ability to dump all of your combo and then get it all back for free right away is absurd. It really, really improves the speed at which you can deal damage. You're wasting a lot less time and deck space getting combo cards into play. You can just run a lot more straight gas, big damage dealers, plenty of things that you can use this for, right? Like any Swift card basically likes to have this. So Hidden Blade spam, it's good. Playing individual power cards like Splatters and In Cold Blood, it's good. You can practically never have too much combo gain, and this is like the most combo gain in one individual relic out of the whole game. So very, very good. Next up, we've got the Dashing Hat. This is a rare that says increase max combo by 1, and every time you play a buff, increase your max combo by 1 again. This one is A tier. It's a pretty unique one. The default +1 max combo is a pretty good effect. Definitely significant, right? Even if you're not playing a single buff card, it's still already doing something pretty powerful for you. Definitely not rare-worthy, but pretty good. Once you start throwing in any number of buffs into the mix, though, it gets a lot better, and Hidden has plenty of good buffs, as we've gone over. It's not at all uncommon to see yourself running 3 or more buffs in your deck. There's plenty that are good with Blackstones. Something like a Thief's Code is pretty good. Obviously, there's the meme of building steam spam. Since that's 0 cost, it upgrades to not expel. You can get a whole bunch of max combo out of that. I've done plenty of runs where I even did really expensive buffs like Smoke Bomb or Response with a Blackstone and double stacked them. Who wouldn't want to just have an extra +3 max combo on top of that? It's pretty strong. You might actually find yourself struggling to max out your combo at that point, but that's a fine problem to have. You know, just having a higher ceiling on your total damage output. It lets you take better advantage of your rage turns. It makes it less likely that you're going to brick on combo gain cards when you don't need combo, because they're a lot more likely to need combo. It can be a bit situational, but I think that overall it's definitely strong enough to warrant an A tier. Next up, we've got the Cheese Knife. Uncommon relic. Each turn, the first time you spend combo, add 1 Hidden Blade to hand. That's a C tier relic. Obviously, you don't want Hidden Blades after you spend combo. You want Hidden Blades before you spend combo. So if you want the Hidden Blade to really do much of anything, you will either need to have an ability to regain your combo after you've generated this thing, Or more likely, you're just going to use this as discard fodder. You're going to, you know, play a juggle or something and toss the hidden blade that way, which is, that's fine, you know, like getting +1 card to discard per turn is a pretty reasonable effect. But that's not always going to line up, and there will be a significant number of cases where the hidden blade is literally just 3 damage to a target of your choice, which is pretty bad. So I have to put it in C tier. Next up, we've got the Orb of Aneurysm. If you don't recognize the artwork for this, you need to watch some more SpongeBob. This one is a common relic. At the end of each turn, for each 25% rage you have, apply Bleed 1 to all enemies. This is also going to be C tier. So it's clear that the concept of this is supposed to be like, oh, rage doesn't interact with bleed generally, so how about you give the bleed focus deck a way to take advantage of rage? But this is just not something that you actually want to have, you know? Like, it's cute in concept if you're gaining rage for some reason. You know, maybe you have some sort of other relic you picked up at random. Maybe it's just from red stones. Then, like, this is theoretically putting bleed on things, but in all likelihood, you're just not going to go for rage-based stuff, right? You're not going to include those cards in your deck. You're not going to seek out those kinds of relics, and that ends up making this not all that much bleed. There are several other common relics that do very similar things in terms of just putting bleed on everybody, and they're all better than this one. So it ends up being pretty low tier. You know, like, I suppose in theory you could, like, really lean into this and do some funny stuff with it, but that's just more of a meme than anything. So meme it up if you want, but I'm going to put it in C tier. Next we have another common artifact, the Living Blood. Whenever you lose health, trigger all bleed. This is the most bleed tier relic I could imagine. This thing is so useless if you don't have a bunch of bleed, and it is so good if you do have a bunch of bleed. This can literally win the void fight for you, right? Like, on its own. You could have a deck that has, like, no chance of winning versus the void, give it a Living Blood, and suddenly it's a slam dunk. It's not that hard to just take a little bit of damage and get a huge reward for it, right? Just don't play that last block card, get hit for like 5 or something, and you've just dealt like a couple hundred points of damage. If you've stacked up a lot of bleed, that's a really good trade deal. You can also just kind of think of this as like a safety net, because if you start taking damage in a fight, that might be a sign that the enemy's scaling out of control, things are going poorly for you, but now all of a sudden the enemy's going to start dying. So if instead of just, you know, getting knocked down into a death spiral of taking damage and you're on the back foot so you're not dealing enough and you just slowly get whittled down, suddenly the enemy is just going to start dying as soon as you start dying. So even in the worst case scenario, this is pretty good, and if you're in a good position, you can still flex it for huge payoff. You'd be very hard pressed to find another common relic capable of reaching the heights that this thing can. So super polarized, but very powerful in the right circumstances. Next, we have an uncommon artifact, the Modern Art. Each time you expel a card, combo 1. That's going in C tier. This one is another one that actually can get pretty strong in the right circumstance, but the right circumstance does not come along very often. I think in all of my time playing Vault, I've only ever had one run where I was like really excited for Modern Art. You see this thing in the Well of Stars a lot as an option you can get, and very often it's just not worth it. Expelling cards, that's mostly going to be in the form of buffs, of course, and in theory, you know, it's kind of nice to get some free combo on a turn when you might have spent a lot of energy setting up some of those expensive buffs that we've talked about. But in actuality, it turns out that you're probably just going to have better options for gaining combo in the first place, so this thing isn't going to be like your reliable option, you know, especially because once you expel those cards that are gone, of course, you won't be able to regain combo in that way. You're still going to have to play your quicknesses and other such things. And if you're playing those, then you have to run into the issue of, like, draw order consistency. So, like, if you've rigged the buffs, maybe, you can play 1 or 2 rigged buffs and get your combo right away, and that's good. But now you're going to brick on the quicknesses and such when you draw those, and that's not a desirable situation to be in. Or if you put, like, black stones in the buffs, or you just didn't have the green stones or the upgrades to rig them, then maybe you draw your other combo gain first, and now the extra combo you're getting off the modern art is just going to waste. A lot of times, it's just very low impact. There are possibilities where, you know, like maybe you are playing one of those balanced spam decks, and you can just cut all of your combo gain at that point and just only get up to combo by playing your buffs. That's like the one time I made use of it was in a deck like that. So it's cool. It's cool in that regard. You know, it has like a unique niche, I guess. It's just that that's a very specific, somewhat obscure situation that you're not going to find yourself in very much. So, C tier. Next, we've got the Combo Platter. Elite artifact each turn. The first time you spend combo, draw 1. That's pretty good, actually. That's an A tier relic, if you ask me. This one is probably most comparable to the Caltrops in that it interacts with combo and gives you potentially 1 card every turn. So this one is probably going to give you fewer cards total than the Caltrops would, but the timing of when you get that card draw can be really handy. The fact that it happens after you spend your combo means that it can actually kind of bail you out early on when you don't really have a cohesive deck set up yet. So if you just have that one starting combo from your relic, you can just play a slash and immediately cycle it into a new card, right? So if you don't have the block you need in hand versus that first elite or something, your slash just draws you a card now. So dig a little bit deeper, maybe find that card you're looking for. And even by the late game, of course, you're probably still spending combo every now and then, if not frequently. Some decks spend combo multiple times every turn. So then it just becomes +1 draw every turn, and that's really good. It doesn't even technically have a cost associated with it the way the Caltrops does. The Caltrops takes away a combo that you would have kept otherwise. This is just a little bonus on top. So quite handy. It's pretty good with expensive cards that spend combo. So you play like a jab or something for 2, then it'll help you refuel a little bit more after the fact. Just a really nice relic. Next, we have the Card Spikes. This is another elite artifact. At the end of your turn, apply bleed 1 to all enemies for each card you drew that turn after drawing your starting hand. This is a C tier artifact. Definitely a C tier. This thing is so infrequently useful. Again, right, like it sounds like on paper it might be pretty good. Hidden can cycle his deck a lot in the middle of his turn, you know, just anything just as simple as a blue stone swift attack. Any swift attack, it doesn't even matter. You put a blue stone on there and suddenly you've drawn quite a few cards. You throw in any of the other ways he has to draw and discard, stuff like juggle, stuff like tools of the trade. You've got the draw from Nick and Jab. You've got lots of ways to draw cards in the middle of your turn. But you really do need to be drawing and discarding quite a lot for this thing to make sense. You know, it is an elite relic, and like we mentioned, there's a handful of lower tier relics that do a pretty comparable thing for the average deck. The thing to think about, of course, as it's an elite relic is if you don't have that kind of deck, you just don't take it, and if you do have that kind of deck, you do, right? Since you always are opting in to elite artifacts, the ones that are a little more situational, you might be skipping them more often. But when the time comes up, then, you know, you can always just grab it at that point. So it's not like it's going to be weighing you down as a useless relic, but you are going to be skipping it a lot. It just doesn't quite live up to the rarity tier that it's in, if you ask me, though. Like, you'll be, in most decks, you'd be getting similar amounts of bleed out of the common and uncommon bleed appliers. Sometimes you won't even be drawing like any cards during the middle of your turn. So, yeah, not too big on this one. And very similar story with this one. The Forgotten Fuse, another elite artifact. At the end of every even turn, deal damage to all enemies equal to the number of cards in your expel and destroy piles. C tier. In general, effects that deal like flat amounts of damage tend to get a lot worse as you climb up in difficulty levels, because enemy health pools get bigger, and the amount of damage that you're realistically going to be getting out of an effect like this is just not all that much. It triggers every other turn, so it's not even particularly reliable. It is contingent upon you generating a bunch of Hidden Blades or Silent Shivs to fill up the destroy pile. The cards in the expel pile, there's really only ever going to be a handful of those, you know, just a couple of buffs. Not super impressive. You can, again, in theory, you can like really lean into this and try and milk it for all it's worth and do some reasonable damage with it, but your efforts would be much better spent just about anywhere else. You're going to see much better returns for your time and effort than with the Forgotten Fuse. This is another one that you're going to be skipping very, very often. Next, we have the Glass Prism. Can you believe this thing used to be an elite, man? Can you believe this was an elite relic? We're just going to put it straight into C tier here. It is not very good. At the start of each turn, it says apply bleed 2 to all vulnerable enemies. You get 2 block for all weak enemies, and you get 2 delay block for all slow enemies. 3 different effects, all of them a little tricky to use, none of them very impactful. Obviously, slow is not something that you're going to be applying very often with Hidden. There's just very few effects in the entire game that you can even access that apply slow, so we can mostly write off slow. That is going to do very little. Block 2 for each weak enemy. I mean, it's okay. If the enemy is weak, you already need less block in the first place, so there's a very significant chance that 2 block is going to waste, if you're even getting it in the first place, right? Because there's not that much weakness out there either that you really want to be including into your deck. So the only effect that's really going to happen all that often is applying bleed 2 to all vulnerable enemies, which, you know, you do have to be stacking up quite a bit of vulnerable, because this happens at the start of the turn, and enemies lose debuffs at the end of the turn. So if you just put 1 stack of vulnerable, then it's just going to go away and you won't get any benefit. You have to be putting multiple stacks. If you have adaptation on, then they're losing additional stacks, and you're even less likely to get value out of this thing. The Void, reducing debuffs faster, obviously just more or less blanks this thing. It's really bad. Just not a good relic. Next, we have the Light Bulb. And the Light Bulb is an elite artifact. The first time each turn you play an attack, add a volatile lighted up to your hand. This is a B tier. This is like the poster child for the 1 free discard fodder per turn kind of effect, right? So something similar to what I was talking about with the butter knife, but this one's a lot better. It is pretty easy to get some value out of that lighted up, more so than you'd ever be getting out of the random Hidden Blade. Lighted ups are expel cards normally, so the fact that you're getting a volatile one is sort of like inherently beneficial, right? A lot of the cost associated with the lighted up, in a way, is that it's like a single-use effect, right? And that's more or less negated, because since it's a volatile copy, it was going to be single-use anyway, right? It's fine to use it for discard fodder, but if you just play this thing at base value for 9 damage and 1 overcharge, that's not bad at all. If you didn't have any overcharge, then it's just paying for itself next turn. 9 damage for completely free is not bad. Being able to use this in tandem with all of the various draw and discard effects to get value that way is pretty good. And the fact that it just triggers off of any attack, it doesn't require you to play like a swift attack or spend combo or anything like that, means that in a pinch you can use the lighted up as a big damage dealer with your combo. 9 damage per trigger base is not at all bad. This thing can actually win fights for you with its damage output. So actually quite a few things that you can be doing with the lighted up, and all of them are pretty decent. It's you are not going to be in a situation very often where the volatile lighted up is just useless, in the same way that you are going to be with like a random volatile hidden blade while you have no combo. So it's pretty good. Next up, the Camo cloak. This is another elite artifact. Every 3rd turn, your threat stack won't trigger. That is a B tier relic. This one is sometimes really, really valuable and sometimes completely useless. But the times when it's good are you're going to be really glad you had this thing, right? Like, for all the fights, you know, maybe once every 5 or 6 fights this thing actually matters, and it will completely save your bacon in those circumstances, right? Like, the Beast of Malice does a huge hit to you on turn 3 and you don't have any block. Camo Cloak's got your back, right? Things just line up unfavorably in any random old boss fight or even just a normal hallway fight. It can come in clutch and keep you alive, you know, like versus the firebugs or something. Any of the fights where enemies can just spike up massive damage out of nowhere. This thing can just completely turn the fight around and give you a chance to find your big block or just end the fight before you need it. It stacks with other effects like hide that cause the threat stack not to trigger. It's really good if you have delay block of any kind. For the circumstances where, you know, you don't have any block on turn 3 anyway, or you still want to full block on that turn because your upcoming draw pile doesn't have enough defense, it will feel bad, but, you know, think of it as like an insurance policy. Next, we've got the red glasses. This is an uncommon artifact. Whenever bleed triggers or is reduced rage 25%, you are C tier. There's even a tooltip on this relic, or it's in the description. In-game, it says rage gained from passive bleed triggering will immediately go away at the end of the turn. That's not very good, is it? Getting rage that just immediately goes away is not beneficial at all, so you really need to be triggering bleed during the middle of your turn in a circumstance where you can take advantage of rage. That's not going to happen very often. The best case scenario is like an in cold blood. Each trigger is going to be getting an extra 25% rage. Like, in theory, there's circumstances where you can use an effect like, you know, like a Crimson Slaughter or a Sanguine Shell to trigger 3 enemies that are bleeding and gain 75% rage, and then you play some sort of big attack, but, I mean, let's be realistic. That's not going to happen all that often. There are not that many ways to trigger bleed in the middle of the turn, and if you are doing that, odds are pretty reasonable that you don't care that much about getting some rage on the same turn. It's not useless. It does, you know, it does something if you have a bleed trigger effect, but this one's not an elite. It's an uncommon. You could get this randomly in a deck that has, like, no bleed, or in a deck that doesn't have abilities to trigger bleed, or in a deck that doesn't have abilities to take much advantage of rage. A lot of the time, this one's kind of just blank. So that is pretty bad. It lands it in C tier. Next, we have the Gilded Sheath, an elite artifact that says the first buff you play each turn costs 2 less. Definitely an A tier. Love this thing. There's plenty of good buffs on hidden. Some of them are pretty expensive. This is a really good way to ensure that you'll have enough energy to play a bunch of them. The fact that it can trigger every single turn means that you can be playing a lot of buffs, cheat a lot of energy with this thing. It makes blackstoning expensive buffs a lot more manageable. I've had, like I've mentioned, plenty of runs where I'm doing like Blackstone Response, Blackstone Smoke Bomb, Blackstone Sleight of Hand. It's a lot easier to set aside like 5 energy per turn or 4 energy per turn to double dip with like a Smoke Bomb or something, rather than a full 6. You can, you know, play some defensive cards alongside those buffs so you're not taking chip damage, or you can just use it to bank some more energy for the next turn to immediately start taking advantage of those powers. It's really good, and if you don't have a lot of buffs, since it's an elite, you just don't need to pick it. Big fan of this one. Next, we've got the Strange Stimulants, another elite. Your max combo is 1 lower when you play an ability combo 1. These are so messed up, man. This is an S tier. It's not always going to be relevant. Sometimes this will, like, ruin your build if you pick it up, you know? That can be true, but +1 combo for every ability is such an insanely abusable effect in a class that has as many cheap abilities as Hidden does, right? You've got rebound on your quicknesses, you've got 0-cost abilities like your dueling buckler, like your congeal. You can just absolutely cram your deck full of decent swift attacks and various abilities, and you're suddenly going to be dealing so much damage with all the free combo you get. It's a lot of fun to use these things, and the power level is definitely there. Just, you know, it's not some sort of auto pick that just wins you the run. It does require, like, some significant forethought and planning to really take advantage of it and know when it's the right time to go in for it. But some of the best decks you'll ever run can be Strange Stimulants decks. So S tier for the Strange Stimulants. Next, we've got the Garnet Band, another elite one that says bleed triggers before enemy actions instead of after, and it doesn't reduce when triggered. This is a solid B tier. It is not bad at all. This one's it's nice because it works in the bleed decks and it works in the blade decks to a pretty similar extent, I would say. The fact that bleed does not go down is very handy for a mostly attack-oriented deck that has a couple clot cards thrown in there, right? Maybe you've got a splatter or a bloodthirst or something like that. And this will be pretty nice for that because you can just throw down a little bit of bleed, and you don't need to worry about the draw order. You don't need to hope that you're drawing the clot card like right after or the same turn as your bleed effect. You can get it whenever. The bleed's going to stick around. And if you're on a bleed-heavy deck, the fact that bleed triggers before the enemies take their actions is pretty good because it can save you from having to deal with whatever action an enemy was going to take in multi-enemy fights. You know, they die before they put their threat on the stack or before they put the garbage cards in your draw pile. That's pretty handy. It means that you can just kind of have like freebie turns here and there where you stack up the bleed on an enemy and immediately write them off, whereas normally that's not possible. In general, the amount of bleed you're going to gain off of this thing from bleed not reducing is somewhat low. So really it is just kind of for bleed uptime, but that's a good enough niche if you ask me. I like this one. In a somewhat similar vein, we've got the Gauze. Reduce all clot costs by 1. Uncommon artifact. This one is gonna be C tier, I'm gonna say. Clot is not something you're gonna have in every deck for sure, so this does have the chance to be blank, and since it's not elite, you might get it in a random effect. Even if you do have clot, if you're using a bunch of clot, then you're probably generating enough bleed for that already. Right, like there's not a lot of decks where you're like, oh, I have these great clot cards, but I just can't put enough bleed on to use them, so I'm just gonna put them in the backpack, and then the Gauze saves the day, right? Like that's not gonna happen. It's really just if you are using clot effects, you're getting a little bit of free bleed, essentially, is what you can read this as, and it really is a very little bit of bleed, unfortunately. The way this works too is that you do still need to meet the clot condition, but then you just don't actually pay the same amount, right? Like, so for example, Splatter has a clot cost of 1. when it's upgraded, that doesn't mean that it's just going to work on an enemy that has no bleed. It doesn't go down to 0 and then it, counts. You still have to have enough bleed on them. It's just that you don't lose that bleed when you're triggering it. So if it did that, I would probably bump it up to B tier, but it does not. So it gets to hang out in C tier. Next, we've got another uncommon, the Crystallized Icker, or icker, however you want to say that. Delay block 1 when bleed is reduced or triggered. This one gets to be B tier. Funnily enough, it kind of compares very closely with the Gauze and the red sunglasses that we were just talking about. But it's a lot better, because unlike Rage, which you don't want to be gaining at the end of the turn when bleed passively triggers, Delay block is pretty good to get at the end of the turn when bleed triggers, and it's also fine to get in the middle of your turn too. You don't really care when you get it, because it just stacks up and then triggers at the start of your next turn. The amount of delay block you can get out of this in a deck that's even just doing a reasonable amount of bleed spread, it doesn't have to be all that much, is pretty significant, right? If you just are, purging a bleed it out or something and putting 3 bleed on everybody, the Crystallized Icker is going to give you 3 delay block at minimum every turn for the next, however many turns, if you're putting more bleed on to count it up. The average fight should last around 4-ish turns, so even if it's just for the 3 turns of bleed that a single copy of Bleed It Out being purged gave you, that is really good, actually. 3 block every single turn for 3 turns is quite good for an uncommon. It might not seem very impressive, but if you break it down and compare the numbers with other similar block generators, this thing actually comes out looking pretty nice, right? Compare this to a flame shield, for example. You got to put in just a little tiny bit of work. It's not that hard, doesn't ask for much, and if you do, the payoff is comparable or even a little bit better with the Crystallized Icker, and it's a whole rarity tier below. So that's a pretty good comparison. That kind of clues you in as to why this might be a nice effect. Next up, we've got the Exploding Pomegranate. Common, at the start of each battle, apply bleed 4 to all enemies. This is another B tier. We're talking about relics that just kind of spread bleed around. This is as standard as it gets, right? All it does is it puts some bleed on and then it turns off. That's it. 4 bleed to everyone on the first turn is actually pretty good, though, it turns out, right? That's 12 bleed total if you're in a multi-enemy fight. That's actually quite a bit. It synergizes very well with all of the stuff that wants bleed uptime, so its 2 neighbors here, the Crystallized Icker and the Garnet Band, are 2 prime examples of very nice effects to pair with your Exploding Pomegranate. Really early in the run, like if you take this off a Matron of Memories or something, it's the damage output is actually going to be pretty significant. This is quite good against like an early Hounds of Hell fight, for example. It's nice. This is another situation where you can make a weird comparison, right? Like the amount of bleed you get off of the Exploding Pomegranate is going to compare pretty favorably to something like, for example, even the card spikes for a lot of decks. You'd be able to get just about as much bleed value from the pomegranate as the card spikes. And this is a common compared to an elite. That's ridiculous, right? So it's pretty solid, even if it is a little boring, I guess. It's good, though. Next, we've got Sanguine Stopwatch. This is an elite. Every 12 attack cards played, trigger bleed on all creatures. That is bleed tier. This one is very similar to the Living Blood in that in the deck that has a whole lot of bleed, this thing is completely ridiculous. And in the deck that does not have very much bleed, it is more or less worthless. They're actually very comparable in that regard, because the power level of this thing when you do have bleed is ridiculous. It's not that hard to trigger this thing every other turn. It's not even all that hard to trigger it every turn in the right build. There's plenty of ways to generate lots of attack cards on Hidden, including a bunch of relics that we're going to get to, and there's already a couple of ways to generate attacks with relics that we've seen here, with the butter knife and with the light bulb and such. So just lots of extra bleed triggers, that's pretty good. It's going to be a lot of damage. And if you don't have the bleed to be triggering, then this thing is worthless. And that's what the bleed tier is for. And another very similar story is the Splattered Sawblade. It's an elite. All of your bleed applying cards apply one more bleed. Obviously, this is ridiculously good if you can generate lots of silent shivs. This is really good with those sorts of bleed spreading, multi-use kind of cards. So things like a sustenance, things like your bleeded out that I keep talking about. It's just really, really good value. It's going to get quite a lot of bleed out. Even in the worst case scenarios, it's going to be, in the worst case scenario for a bleed deck, this thing is still pretty reasonable. And in the best case scenario for a bleed deck, it's insane. In the worst case scenario for a non-bleed deck, it's basically useless. I would say that this one doesn't quite have the same top-end potential as something like the stopwatch usually does. Because it really does want you to have a lot of silent shivs to make full use of it, and most decks don't have that many, but it's still pretty good, even in those decks without a bunch of silent shivs, so bleed tier for that. Next up is the Knave's Qatar, another elite. This one says, every fourth non-balanced swift attack that you play is balanced. So once you've figured out what that actually means, you'll probably recognize that it's not all of that good of an effect. So the Knave's Qatar is going to go into the C tier. You have to play 4 non-balanced swift attacks, so cards that actually spend your combo. The first 3, nothing happens. The 4th one, you get to keep your combo. Cool, I guess. Right? Like, it's so difficult to imagine a situation where you'd be, like, really excited to find this thing. It is theoretically, like, decent combo generation, I guess. It's actually probably not that uncommon for decks to not even play more than 4 swift attacks in a standard, like, elite fight, for example, right? Like, if you're going up against an early elite, like you're fighting a skeletal mage or something, maybe, you know, that's a fight that's going to be kind of slow. It's going to drag out. You might get the chance to get some value out of this. But by the later game, you're probably going to be going pretty fast. And the fact that you would have to be, you know, gaining combo and then spending it on swift cards 4 times within the same fight before this does literally anything is not that good, right? Like, it does carry over from fight to fight. So, you know, but on average, that's the way we want to think about it, is in terms of averages. If you have a lot of balanced cards as your strategy, it's not very good. If you're just mostly focused on bleed and not playing many attacks, it's not very good. If you get the value out of this thing, but then you've, like, you know, bricked by drawing your combo cards on the turn where you did that, then those are going to waste, and that's not very good. You can't, like, realistically alter your deck to keep this thing in mind. I don't think you're going to cut combo gain because you go, oh, I have the Knave's Qatar now, right? So that is a C tier relic. Next we have the Runed Pommel. This is an elite. Each time you cast your spell, combo 1. That is a pretty decent effect, enough to put this guy in B tier. Obviously, the Blade spell that you start with has a 5-turn cooldown, which is really long, and so that's kind of seems like it might be bad to pair with this thing. But the fact that it gives you a Hidden Blade is actually really handy because you can immediately use that combo, and it's giving you combo in and of itself, that spell, so now you're getting +2 combo with the one you started with. That means you're getting full combo immediately off of your spell, and that's actually quite good. Any other spell that you swap for basically is going to be an improvement on that in terms of the cooldown. You know, if you get Weapon Switch or something like that, one of the 2-cost spells, then this thing actually becomes a very serious combo generator, which is really good. But even just with a 3 or 4 coster, it's not that bad, right? Even if you're just getting 1 combo out of this per turn, the fact that it's combo whenever you want on demand makes it very easy to take full advantage of this thing. The fact that you can get multiple uses out of it in a fight without having to, you know, go too crazy. You don't have to drag things out for all that long if you just have a regular 3-turn cooldown spell that you got from a boss or something. It's far from outrageous to imagine that you just use this on turn 1 and then after the spell's cooldown is off, you use it again. 2 combo from this relic at good times. Pretty valuable. Pretty valuable. I like this one. Next we have the Basket Hilted Broadsword. This one is an elite. Block 3 for each combo consumed. This one is going to go in B tier. 3 block per combo consumed means that in general from the early turns you're going to be getting 9 block out of this thing because you usually just want to go up to full combo and then play a good swift card. Getting 9 block the same time as you do one of your big attacks is quite nice because that means that if you need to play cards, let's say, to build up your combo before you can play that swift attack, it's all right that you might not have energy or resources left to block. This thing is going to handle that for you. It's also convenient if you have just a little bit of combo and you're not really going to be able to deal that much damage anyway, but you're focusing on defense. You can use like a useless slash or something in the early game to get a decent amount of block, and then you regain combo next turn, so it's not really hurting you. It's a pretty handy effect. It does fall off, I would say, the later you go into the run, but early on this can be pretty nice. Pretty handy for dealing with those early elites. You might want to grab this just to make the fight a bit easier if you're in a tight spot. Not the best, but good enough. Next, we have the Cutting Fan. Every 12 attack cards played, gain 3 hidden blades. Definitely an S tier, if you ask me. Definitely an S tier. This thing is so powerful. So the first and most obvious thing to notice is that it cares about you playing attacks, and its reward is it gives you a bunch of free attacks to play. So it just naturally feeds itself, right? Those 3 hidden blades are just like a down payment on the next trigger of your Cutting Fan, so you really only need to play 9 attacks to get this thing going once it's triggered for the first time. So that's pretty good. You think about all of the other various relics that care about you playing hidden blades or generating hidden blades or playing 0-cost cards. We've looked at plenty of those already, right? The Arsenal, the Fox, there's more to come. There's plenty of neutral relics even that care about you playing attack cards, so stuff like the like Clockwork. There's things that just care about you playing cards in general, like the Torch of Triumph. There's so many ways to take advantage of the hidden blades, even not accounting for all of the specific stuff about hidden and why he would want them in particular, right? There are a ton of powers that you have that can boost the damage of your hidden blades, stuff like Sleight of Hand, stuff like something extra. It goes really well with big rage generation. It goes really well with, I mean, just about everything, right? Like this, you would be extremely hard-pressed to find a hidden deck that would not significantly appreciate the presence of a Cutting Fan. Even the bleed deck, you know, you start out with those draw bloods. That's 2 attacks in 1 for the cost of just 1 energy. So, you know, immediate damage is valuable sometimes in the bleed deck because you just need to kill something before it's going to take its action. It's just such a powerful effect. Definitely one of my favorites. Definitely a great relic. In a very similar vein, we've got the Blade Belt. This is an elite. When you play your 4th attack in 1 turn, gain 2 hidden blades. This one is A tier. It is very similar to the Cutting Fan, but just kind of a little bit worse in most ways, if you ask me. But that's still very good. Being a bit worse than one of the strongest artifacts is not really much of an insult against you. So this one has a significantly lower ceiling. It is limited to once per turn, and it gives you a smaller number of hidden blades. You're only getting 2 instead of 3. But it is theoretically, like, you know, it's easier to trigger this thing every turn because 4 attacks in 1 turn is a smaller ask than 9 attacks in 1 turn. So, like, if you think about it that way, you could say, oh, you might get more value out of this thing turn over turn, right? Like, if the fight lasts 5 turns and you triggered this thing 4 of those turns, you might think that you're getting more hidden blades than with the cutting fan. And I suppose that's, like, theoretically true. But in practice, I think you'll find that the bigger burst of resource all at once with the cutting fan is definitely a more powerful upside. The fact that you can set it up from one turn to the next to plan out a big power turn is a big deal, and what have you. But the blade belt's still very good. It does still have almost all of the same synergies as I was talking about with cutting fan, about just wanting to spam out attacks, generate hidden blades, play cards, all of that stuff. These two pair really nicely with each other because the blade belt feeds the cutting fan, or if you trigger the cutting fan early, it feeds the blade belt. They're excellent friends with each other. Really, really good relic. Next, we have the Hemolytic vial. This is an elite. Every 4th battle round, trigger the bleed of all enemies at the start of your turn. You are going to be in C tier, Hemolytic vial, sorry. The fact that it says every 4th round is kind of irrelevant because, let's be real, 8 rounds is something that should really not be happening very often at all. A good run should have 0 fights that last that long, right? There are sometimes good decks that take that long to kill, but usually if it's turn 8 and you're still in the fight, something has gone horribly wrong, and you certainly are not going to be very likely to have a lot of bleed on the enemy to be getting value out of this thing, right? If you had that much bleed, then the fight would have ended already. There are some specific exceptions, like, you know, the void fight is probably going to last that long, and you might have that much bleed, but even then, this is a lot less damage than you'd be able to get out of something like the Living Blood. You know, again, this is an elite artifact compared to a common here, and the common's looking like it comes out on top in the void fight specifically. Outside of the void fight, you know, the fact that this does not require you to take damage is appealing, I guess, but it doesn't do anything until turn 4. It might not do that much on turn 4 anyway, just depending on the draw order where the bleed's gone. It's pretty useless, obviously, if you don't have much bleed. If you're just a physical attack, hidden blade spam type of deck, this thing sucks. But it doesn't go in bleed tier because even if you do have the bleed, it's not that good. It is just a thoroughly underwhelming artifact. Next, we have the Amulet of Speed. This is another elite. The second time each turn you gain combo 1. This is B tier. It's not as bad as it might seem at first blush, requiring it to be the second time because your starting relic giving you combo does count. So you're pretty much always going to be gaining that one combo. If you play into it just like at all, especially in the early game, you're pretty much always going to be gaining that one combo. So that just means you play any card that gives you one more, like your quickness, and you're at full combo just like that. Pretty good, very powerful in the early game. Before you get a chance to upgrade your quicknesses, this thing is really, really nice because it basically upgrades them for you and saves you some energy in that regard. Pretty handy. It is really good in longer fights that have dragged on and your combo cap has naturally increased from the starting relic. So on turn 4, when you go up to 4 combo, now your typical thing that gets you to 3 out of 3 is going to get you to 4 out of 4, right? You start with 1 free, you double play an upgraded quickness, and the Amulet of Speed triggers, you're now at 4 out of 4. That's pretty good. So it's got some solid utility for fights that go a little bit longer. It's pretty good in the early game. Synergizes quite well with anything that increases combo cap. It is not bad at all. Next we have another rare, the Throwing Star. When you play a card that costs 2 or more energy, combo 1. This is gonna be B tier by the standards of a rare. There aren't that many cards that cost 2 or more that you're gonna be playing. There's a handful, of course, but plenty of them also are cards that you don't actually want to play much. You just want to hang on to them until the time is right. So the Bleeded Out that I keep mentioning, something like a Sanguine Shell, these are cards that you mostly want to purge. and you're not going to be getting the value out of the throwing star for them. It kind of has some uses with like if you're double playing a Blackstone power, like I mentioned, a smoke bomb or something, you can get combo out of that. Sort of like I was saying with the modern art, that it works in the same way there. It's pretty good with jab, I guess. It's not like a bad relic, let me make that much clear. It's pretty good. You'll probably have at least one 2-cost card that you do want to play when you see it more often than not in your deck, and just getting one free combo on that is handy, right? Something like an Apprentice Blade. It has a few really exceptional interactions, so Phantom Walk is probably the best one. Phantom Walk as a 2-cost card that gives you a bunch of hidden blades and ghosts, so you can just keep playing it over and over. Easy way to fill up your combo while also generating things to take advantage of that combo. That's pretty nice. But in general, this one's a bit less exciting than most of the other rares you could get. So, moving on. Next, we have the Mitten Gauntlet. This is a common. When playing a balanced card at 0 combo, block 5. That is not very good, even for a common. So we're going to put it down in C tier here. I mean, how are you triggering this, right? How are you actually triggering this? You have to spend all of your combo and then play something that's balanced, which obviously is not what you want to do. You want to play your balanced cards before you use your combo, and it's usually very easy to order things in that way. So unless you find yourself in a circumstance where you can afford to miss out on that damage and you really need the block, and you have this thing, like, I guess in that case, maybe it saves you from taking a little bit of chip. I don't know. It's really quite awkward. I suppose it combos with the cheese knife or the butter knife. I forget which one. The one that gives you a hidden blade when you play out when you spend your combo. Woohoo! There's your amazing 2 relic combo. Yeah, this is a blank artifact most of the time, right? Like, in theory, since this isn't like a once per turn kind of thing, you could get a bunch of block out of this if you somehow generated a whole lot of hidden blades or shivs or something when you didn't have any combo. But again, the fact that it has to be 0, and you're starting with 1 minimum on every turn because of your starting relic, means you do actually have to go out of your way to spend that combo. So it asks you to do quite a bit to get its benefits. Not a very good one. Next up is an uncommon, the Twin Blade. Your max combo is increased by 1. Nice and simple to the point, and it's pretty good. It's A tier, if you ask me. The extra combo cap is really strong. It's like I was talking about with the Dashing Hat. There are plenty of ways to take advantage of it. It is a powerful effect. This one doesn't have any additional upside, but it is significantly lower rarity, so that's why it gets to be in the same tier as the hat. Yeah, not much else new to say about that one. It's just pretty strong. Next up, we have the Serpent's Skull, a common. When a bleeding enemy dies, apply 50% of their bleed to a random enemy. This is going to be another bleed tier. It's a pretty good amount of damage, actually, if you are applying a bunch of bleed. The fact that it goes on a random enemy kind of sucks, because in a lot of fights there is a specific kill order that you want to go for. So, you might lose that 50-50, but even in those cases where, let's say you're fighting the malformed guys, and maybe you have a deck where you kill the Exalted Warrior in the middle first, and then the Rotting Gut Fiend gets the bleed instead of the Flesh Beast. That's a pretty unfortunate circumstance. So it does have some moments where it just kind of fails. But otherwise, it's just a nice little bit of extra damage. You'll appreciate it. The biggest downside about it is just that it doesn't do anything versus most elites. But it does do quite a bit versus the Void, actually. Since the minions there, you're going to need to put quite a bit of bleed on them to kill them, probably. And then you're still getting a lot of value out of the energy you spent to do that. That's pretty nice. It's not the most impactful thing, but it's a common, you know, right? What do you want from it? I think it does pretty well for its rarity in a bleed deck. Obviously, it's really bad if you're not focusing on bleed, though. Next, the oversized knife. Starting from turn 3, your max combo is increased by 1. Common relic. This one is going to be A tier. It's pretty much a perfect downgrade from the twin blade. For being a common, that's totally fair that it's going to be less powerful. It's still really good to have extra combo. The fact that it happens on turn 3, which is one turn before your starter relic kicks in, is pretty nice. Gives you a little boost of power a bit earlier than you'd normally be getting it. And then when the starter relic kicks in next turn, now you're all the way up to 5 combo. That's pretty good. It's just a nice common. Again, very similar to the twin blade, so not too much more to say about that. Next, we have the Poisoning Kit. This is a common. Whenever you use a potion, apply Bleed 8 to all enemies. Wow, is this one a stinker? C tier. It's not good. Potion use does not happen very frequently, and when it does, it's often not really in a controlled circumstance. Oftentimes, you'll be using a potion because, you know, like something's gone wrong and you need some block, or you need to apply vulnerable or gain rage or draw cards to close out a fight right then and there. Many cases where that bleed 8 is utterly worthless. Being able to start with 8 bleed on an enemy when you've like brewed a potion, I guess, is nice. But it's not that nice. The fact, if you're playing with blind spot on, brewing potions for normal combats doesn't even happen very often. So it's really just going to be for like elites and Vault Guardians and stuff where you're brewing, and in many of those cases the bleed 8 isn't that valuable because it's just going on a single target, or it could even actively harm you, right? Like, you know, going up against the Weavers or something. You put bleed 8 on them and now they're going to poison you. You didn't want that to happen, but if you have the Poisoning Kit, too bad. I don't like this one. Next, we've got the Boots of Quickness. This is an elite. If you start a turn with 3 energy or less, add a volatile sidestep to your hand. This one gets to be A tier. Basically, all of the positive stuff I said about the light bulb also applies to the Boots of Quickness. It's pretty easy to meet the condition. Not that hard to start a turn with 3 energy or less. And if you are low on energy, then you are going to be all the more appreciative of the free card. Obviously, sidestep scales with your energy, so it's weaker when you have low energy. But, I mean, it costs 0, and it's a volatile card, so there's no lost value from not purging it. So it is just free block in the absolute worst case scenario. Even freer than the so-called free damage you were going to get from the light bulb. Because you don't have to wait a turn for overcharge to kick in to get the energy back, or, you know, if you already have overcharge, you're not actually really getting the energy. None of that kind of issues. The sidestep is just there. You can just immediately purge cards if you do need the sidestep to block for more. You can discard it as you would usually. It is just a really nice effect. Just a little bit better than the light bulb, enough to bump it into A tier. Very good relic. Next is the Thief's Tools. This is uncommon. At the start of each fight, you put a Celerity into the deck, which is a 0-cost ability that says gain combo equal to your max and expel. That is a pretty strong effect. In fact, it's strong enough for me to put it in A tier. The Celerity is pretty powerful for setting up kill turns. The ability to potentially use 2 strong damage-dealing Swift cards back-to-back for 0 additional energy spent is really nice. Really, really nice. It helps you do sync kills. It helps you milk your rage for additional value if you have a lot of rage on that turn. Or, like, you know, if you have a stack of vulnerable that's going to go away. All of that stuff. Really, really nice. Hidden has plenty of ways to draw and discard through his deck, so it's not all that difficult to find the Celerity when you might need it. It's just kind of a nice little bonus whenever it pops up. It's a little unreliable, of course, because it could go anywhere in the deck. It could be on the bottom of the deck, and maybe you really need it now. But all things considered, the average result, I would say, for Celerity is pretty strong. Next, we've got the 4-leaf clover. This is a rare. If an enemy has bleed at the start of your turn, draw 1 card and apply 2 bleed to all enemies. Wow. That's a really, really good effect. Obviously, if you are playing a deck that cares about putting bleed on enemies, this is just always going to be active every single turn besides the first turn. But there's even ways to make it work on turn 1, like with the exploding pomegranate and stuff, so that's pretty cool. Or I guess the poisoning kit, right? With a brewed potion. But yeah, even if it's not active on turn 1, that's fine, right? Because you're going to be drawing +1 card every turn after that, which is really, really nice, especially because after you've triggered this once, it puts 2 bleed on all enemies, and then it just keeps itself live. It's really unlikely that you're going to clot away all that bleed, or that the only enemies with bleed will die, or like purge their debuffs or something and leave an enemy that doesn't have bleed. Really unlikely. You trigger this thing once, you're off to the races. You don't mind at all slotting in a handful of bleed cards just to get this thing going. You know, the purge effect on the bleeded app that I keep mentioning, random decent block cards like sustenance and stuff that can be applying bleed. All the other various bleed-applying relics that we've talked about, right? You know, you've got your stinging nettles, you've got your... what's another one that we've talked? I'm sure we've mentioned another one, right? Do any of these other ones? Yeah, the card spikes. There we go. There's another one. there's a handful of ways to get the bleed on. It's not that difficult. There's more coming up. In fact, the very next one is another relic that applies bleed. It's basically bottle of whiskey, but slightly less value since you miss that turn 1 almost always. But then it has the additional upside of just putting bleed everywhere. And I would say that's probably better for Hidden because it really lets you take advantage of cloud effects. It really lets you take advantage of anything that cares about bleed uptime. You know, your evades get extra block and stuff. It's probably going to get you more value from the bleed it applies than you would have received from +1 card on turn 1. Just a very, very strong relic. And that next bleed-applying relic we were talking about is the Hemorrhage Shrooms, coming in at common. At the start of your turn, apply bleed 2 to a random enemy. So this one is also going to be B tier. It's going right next to the pomegranate. The pomegranate was 4 to everybody on the first turn. Hemorrhage Shrooms is 2 to 1 enemy on every turn. So in the multi-target fights, the Hemorrhage Shrooms are probably not ever going to catch up to the pomegranate in terms of total raw value. But in single-target fights, the Hemorrhage Shrooms catch up on turn 2. And then it's all upside from there. So that's pretty nice. It's another decent way to have bleed uptime. It is very comparable to the pomegranate. Not too much else to say about it. Just a little bit worse at AoE fights, a little bit better at single-target fights. Next, we've got the Blood Amulet. The first time you apply bleed in a turn, block 3. This is common. This one goes in bleed tier. This is really, really strong, actually. If you are on a bleed build, it is pretty comparable to the Crystallized Icker in terms of the amount of block you can be getting out of it. It would actually be pretty reasonable even outside of a bleed deck if you just have 1 or 2 random bleed applying cards, right? Just like 3 block randomly every now and then out of a common is not bad at all. So all of the usual culprits, the sustenance and what have you, make this pretty solid outside of bleed, and within bleed it's pretty much always triggering every turn, and that's great. That is great value from a common. Next up, the trusty Fishhook, a rare. At the start of each even turn, add 3 hidden blades to hand. This one is very similar to the cutting fan. It's probably a tiny bit less good because it is definitely possible and pretty realistic that you trigger your cutting fan more often than every other turn, especially by the end game. In the early game, though, when that's not happening, the Fishhook is more consistent. Again, obviously, they're good friends with each other because the Fishhook feeds the cutting fan. You know, Blade Belt can get in the mix in there. All of the usual suspects, the counting relics, the guys that care about attacks. Very good stuff. It
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of just it, right? It's Cutting Fan, but slightly different. It's a side grade to one of the best relics in the game. It's really good. Next, we have the Dark Feather. This one's uncommon. The first time each turn you expel a card, draw one. This is another S tier. That is ridiculous. That is such a powerful effect. Drawing a card every time you expel a card in a turn, well, the first time you expel a card in a turn, is really, really powerful. It's great with buffs. It's great with, I mean, literally anything that expels, right? If a card says expel on it, and you were even considering playing it before you got the Dark Feather, well, guess what? Now it's amazing. The one like negative thing I can say about this is that it doesn't work well if you draw all the buffs early on the same turn or something, right? Or like with the Blackstone buffs, because it's once per turn. Realistically, though, that's just, if your biggest problem is that you got all of your buffs down quickly and only drew one card instead of 2 or 3, like, you're probably still doing fine. This thing's great. Next, we've got the Lucky Shiv. This is an uncommon. Each time you play a slash or draw blood, add 1 hidden blade to your hand. This is quite bad. It goes in C tier. Playing a slash spends your combo, so the hidden blade you're getting is not very valuable at that point. Just like this guy that we talked about earlier, a hidden blade that is just 3 damage is pretty bad. You can still use it as discard fodder theoretically, which is like fine, I guess, but it's a lot more awkward to make advantage of that. You usually don't want to have any slashes left in your deck by the end of the run. So it's really only just like sort of okay-ish at the very early game for being a little bit of extra damage potentially. Getting hidden blades when you play draw bloods is a much better prospect. Even then, though, you're not going to keep around that many draw bloods as the run goes on, so in the bleed deck, it's like pretty decent as an early game option, but it will still fall off pretty quick. Best case scenario, this thing is just giving you some extra fodder to count towards like Cutting Fan or Blade Belt, I guess, which it's like okay in that circumstance, but that's not exactly high praise, right? Lastly, the Fan of Blades. Every 3 Swift card played, apply Bleed 2 to all enemies. This is uncommon. That is going to be A tier. It's pretty nice. 3 Swift cards in 1 turn is not that difficult. So if you do 3 Swift cards every turn, it's permanent bleed uptime plus some extra damage on top of that because the number's going to keep increasing. Even if you only trigger it every other turn, it's still permanent uptime. It can go any number of times per turn, so it's really good with all those hidden blade spam artifacts that we were talking about. Quite a bit of bleed, quite a bit of damage. Definitely a suitable improvement over the common bleed appliers, right? Like this matches up pretty nicely versus the pomegranate. So that nets it in A tier, and that is every hidden class specific relic. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. If you liked this, make sure to subscribe to see more videos of the sort. Check out my hidden card tier list if you haven't seen that yet. And I will see you guys all in the next video.